in the middle of a deadly winter storm. Would you stop your patrol if you saw a massive hand, 5 fingers the size of a shovel, trembling from beneath the snow? Ruth Ann Kepler did. A 31-year-old forest ranger, alone in the Montana woods, she pulled from the blizzard not a man, but something far older. Not a bear, not a monster. A male Bigfoot, bleeding, bound by wire, and looking straight at her. As she brought him into the light, he placed one hand on his chest and then on hers, his way of saying, "Thank you." That night she realized, she was no longer alone. This isn't just folklore. I'm the one who reviewed the sealed Aspen Fork logs after a fire erased them from public record. And what I found will change everything you think you know about these woods. You'll uncover the truth behind Pine Ridge Ranch, where Bigfoots were trained like circus animals, and meet a teenage girl who drew what she saw but was never believed. You'll see why a dying creature placed his hand on a ranger's badge, like passing on the torch of guardianship. Ruth Ann saw him cry when he recognized his mate and child sketched by a trembling hand. She saw him vanish into the mist after saving lives, never asking for anything in return. If you believe there are things beyond maps and reason, this is your story. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to greet you properly, wherever you are in the world. In the middle of a deadly winter storm, would you stop your patrol if you saw a massive hand, 5 fingers the size of a shovel, trembling from beneath the snow? Ruth Ann Kepler did. A 31-year-old forest ranger, alone in the Montana woods, she pulled from the blizzard not a man, but something far older. Not a bear, not a monster. A male Bigfoot, bleeding, bound by wire, and looking straight at her. As she brought him into the light, he placed one hand on his chest and then on hers, his way of saying thank you. That night she realized she was no longer alone. This isn't just folklore. I'm the one who reviewed the sealed Aspen Fork logs after a fire erased them from public record. And what I found will change everything you think you know about these woods. You'll uncover the truth behind Pine Ridge Ranch, where Bigfoots were trained like circus animals, and meet a teenage girl who drew what she saw but was never believed. You'll see why a dying creature placed his hand on a ranger's badge, like passing on the torch of guardianship. Ruth Ann saw him cry when he recognized his mate and child sketched by a trembling hand. She saw him vanish into the mist after saving lives, never asking for anything in return. If you believe there are things beyond maps and reason, this is your story. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to greet you properly, wherever you are in the world. The wind was a voice tonight, thin, high, and full of warning as it whipped across the frozen skin of Georgetown Lake, rattling the metal sign that marked the old Forest Service turnoff. Snow peeled sideways in long, stinging sheets, blinding the headlights of the lone green pickup carving its way down the narrow mountain road. The forest loomed black and endless on either side, trees bending under the weight of ice and age. It was a storm that made the roads vanish, a storm that made the night feel older than time. Ruth Ann Kepler kept both hands tight on the wheel, her breath shallow, her jaw locked. The truck's heater blew weak warmth at her knees, but it couldn't touch the chill running up her spine. She'd done this drive 100 times, knew every turn of the logging road down to the cracks in the guardrail. But something about this night, it felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Her father used to say there were nights when the land remembered. Nights when the snow came not just to cover, but to preserve something it didn't want to let go of. She hadn't thought of his voice in months, maybe years. And yet here it was now, echoing through the static of the forest and the low, broken cough of the CB radio. She reached for the mic, thumbed the switch. "Aspen Fork Base, this is Unit 12. Do you copy? Over." The speaker hissed. Then nothing. Just a warbled burst of white noise, swallowed by wind. "Damn it," she muttered. The radio had been acting up since this afternoon, but now it was worse. Everything was worse in this storm. She slowed as she rounded the bend that opened up to the edge of the lake. Visibility was next to nothing, only the high beams cutting narrow blades through the thick curtain of snow. That's when she saw it. Something ahead, hunched on the shoulder of the road. At first it looked like a downed tree or a pile of drifted snow, but it moved, just barely. Her foot lifted off the gas. The truck idled, growling low. The thing shifted again, and the light caught it this time, just enough to reveal a dark, massive shape curled against the snowbank, steam rising in ribbons from its back like breath from a dying horse. She squinted, leaned forward, heart thudding behind her ribs. It was big. Too big. Bigger than a man, covered in something that looked like soaked fur or thick brush. She eased the truck to the side and killed the engine, the sudden silence pressing into her ears like altitude. The snow ticked softly against the windshield. She didn't move. Not at first. Then a sound. A grunt. No, not a grunt. A breath. Hoarse and wet and close to breaking. She grabbed her flashlight from the dash and stepped out into the storm. The cold slapped her hard across the face, taking her breath. She pulled her coat tighter, boots crunching across the icy gravel. The beam of the flashlight swept over the thing in the snow, and her knees almost buckled. A hand. It was a hand. Not paw, not hoof. 5 fingers, thick and calloused, tipped in split, cracked nails. The knuckles were raw, the palm leathery, scarred. The wrist led up to an arm, massive, muscular, matted in dark, filthy fur. Blood caked one side of its flank where a jagged piece of steel jutted out near the ribs. Old barbed metal, rusted and curled like it had been pulled from a trap made for something not meant to live. "Jesus," she whispered. The thing stirred, but barely. A low sound escaped it, something deeper than pain. Something old. For a second, Ruth stood frozen. Everything in her screamed to back away, but she didn't. Instead, she dropped to one knee in the snow. She reached out cautiously, flashlight quivering in one hand, the other brushing snow away from its shoulder. The flesh was burning hot beneath the fur. Fever, infection. Whatever it wasn't going to last the night. She hesitated only a second longer, then pulled the wool blanket from the back of her truck and began wrapping it as best she could. The body was far too heavy to lift outright. She looped the tow cable from the winch around its midsection, careful not to worsen the wound. The hoist groaned under the strain as she dragged it inch by inch toward the open tailgate. The snow muffled everything. No cars, no birds, not even wind through the trees. The storm, somehow, had gone quieter. Watching. Inside the cabin at Aspen Fork, the kerosene stove hissed as firelight cast tall flickers along the log walls. Ruth knelt beside the cot, breathing hard, cheeks flushed from cold and adrenaline. She'd laid the creature on the floor, wrapped in every blanket she had. The metal was still lodged in its side, crusted deep with old blood and new. She hadn't called for backup. She hadn't told a soul. Somewhere in her chest, an ache she hadn't felt since the fire in Flint Creek flared up again. That night, she'd been alone too. That night, the fire had moved faster than anyone thought possible. Her father hadn't made it. She had. She didn't remember how. Just the heat, the smoke. And then, something lifting her. She blinked, swallowing hard. The creature stirred. A heavy breath. Then another. Its head turned slightly, eyes blinking open. Dark, glassy, wide. It didn't flinch. Didn't growl. It looked at her. For a long, motionless stretch, they simply breathed. And then, it raised one hand slowly, fingers trembling, and placed it flat against its own chest. Ruth's heart skipped. The hand moved again, toward her. She didn't move. The palm rested gently against her chest, just over her heart. She could feel the heat, the weight. They sat like that, locked in breath. Not man, not beast. 2 survivors. She blinked, but didn't pull away. Then, a sound from outside. Distant, faint. A crunch, snow. She stood slowly, moved to the window. The trees beyond the cabin swayed slightly in the dim orange wash of the cabin's outside lantern. Snow drifted thick, and there, a shadow, larger than any man, motionless, watching. Not a reflection, not an illusion. It stood just at the edge of the pines, shape half-eaten by distance and snowfall, but unmistakably real. She didn't breathe. Behind her, the creature on the cot shifted, letting out a low, melodic rumble that vibrated the floorboards. It wasn't fear. It was calling. The shape in the trees did not move. Ruth stepped back, slowly pulled the curtain closed, but her hand lingered on the fabric. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, fire crackled low. And in that hush between breath and silence, she realized she wasn't alone. Not anymore, and maybe she never had been. Not on this mountain. Not in these woods. Not since the fire. The kettle whistled on the stove. And still, the shadow stood there, waiting. The snow hadn't let up by morning. It came down quieter now, like breath instead of thunder, but it kept falling, soft, steady, and without apology. The pines outside Aspen Fork bent gently beneath its weight, and the trees had that stillness that only comes after a night the mountain wanted to remember. Ruth stood by the window, cradling a chipped mug of black coffee, her hand barely steady. The floorboards creaked behind her. The thing, he, was still alive, curled beneath the wool blankets like a felled god, the wound at his ribs wrapped in gauze and silence. He hadn't stirred since placing that enormous hand over her chest. Not a single sound since. But she knew he was awake, watching, breathing, listening with something far older than human instinct. The clock on the wall ticked too loud in the hush. Ruth's mind circled the night like a hawk above a clearing, tracing everything she saw and couldn't explain. The hand, the wound, the sound he made when the shape appeared outside the cabin. She hadn't slept. Not a wink. Something inside her had shifted, something wordless and rooted in old grief. She remembered that summer after her father died, how the rangers brought out old maps and told her where the fire had jumped, where he was last seen. She remembered the weight of that silence when they stopped looking, but she also remembered that moment, one she never told anyone about, right before blacking out from smoke inhalation, when she thought she felt arms lifting her, carrying her through flames. She told herself it was a rescue team, but now she wasn't so sure. A knock broke the silence. 3 short raps on the side door. Not the front. That was the first sign it was Maeve. Ruth crossed the cabin, unlocked the door, and pulled it open into a gust of cold and flurries. Dr. Maeve Collins stood bundled in her thick parka, her pale cheeks flushed red from the cold, eyes already squinting past Ruth into the dim room beyond. "You didn't say what kind of emergency," Maeve said, brushing snow from her shoulders. "Just that it couldn't go to the station." Ruth stepped aside. "It can't." Maeve hesitated. Her boots crunched over the threshold, and the door clicked shut behind her. The firelight stretched across the room in golden fingers, catching on the coarse fur of the shape beneath the blankets. "What the hell?" she whispered, not finishing the thought. "I need you to look at the wound. He's stable, for now. But there's something in his side. It looks infected." Maeve set her bag on the table without a word. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm, unzipping, laying out tools, disinfectants, gauze, saline. But her eyes kept drifting toward the cot, narrowing in that way that wasn't fear, but calculation. The mind doing its best to catch up with the heart. She stepped closer. The shape didn't move. Maeve crouched beside it, gently lifted the edge of the blanket. "Oh my God." She leaned in, inspecting the torn skin near the ribs. The fur around it had been clipped away. The metal piece was still embedded, rust curling at its edges. Maeve reached out with tweezers, probing gently. The creature let out a low, rumbling exhale, but didn't strike. "This isn't a trapper's snare," she murmured. "It's livestock-grade barbed steel," reinforced. the kind they use on black market cattle fences. Ruth's face tightened. Pine Ridge? Maeve didn't answer right away. She leaned back on her heels and stripped off her gloves. I've seen this kind of wound once before. A bear wandered into the South Canyon 5 years back, near that abandoned Wrangler camp. Same pattern, same tearing. You know where that camp was? Ruth nodded. West of the ridgeline, property lines overlap with the Duval holdings. Maeve turned her head, brow furrowed. You think they're trapping these things? I think he came here for a reason. Ruth's voice was low. And I think someone's been doing this for a long time. Maeve said nothing. Her eyes drifted toward the corner of the cabin where the wood stove ticked. The shadows shifted across the ceiling. Stay with him, Ruth said quietly. I'll be right back. She stepped into the back room, a storage area cluttered with old ranger reports, topographic maps, rusted lanterns, and the broken pieces of what used to be her father's life. The dust in here always smelled like old cedar and loss. She crouched by the file cabinet, pulled out the drawer marked Kepler T. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, not until her hand landed on the small leather-bound journal her father had carried in the field. She flipped through pages of fire data, patrol notes, sketches of tree rings and migration tracks. Then she found it, a loose scrap of cured hide tucked between 2 pages. She unfolded it slowly. There it was, a symbol carved into the flesh. Simple, angular. 3 triangles nested inside each other, lines extending outward like veins. She'd seen this before. Not here, not in the journals. In her dream, the night of the fire. When the flames closed in and that shape pulled her from the smoke, she remembered looking down and seeing that symbol on something it carried. Something like a pouch or satchel. She carried the piece into the main room and laid it on the table. Maeve looked up. Where'd you find that? It was hidden in the supply drawer. I thought it was just part of Dad's old gear, but she trailed off. The creature shifted. A groan. Low. Wounded. It opened its eyes and fixed them on the leather square. Then, slowly, it nodded. Once. Maeve stepped back, eyes wide. It understands. Ruth looked at the handprint symbol again. My dad used to say there was an ancient path carved into these mountains, used long before white men showed up. He thought it was migratory, something older than elk or moose, but he never got to prove it. You think this is what he was tracking? I think this is who saved me. Maeve sank into a chair, rubbing her hands together. You realize what this means. If someone's trapping them, if there's more than one, there is. Ruth moved to the window. The storm had eased, but the forest still hung heavy with silence. Through the blur of frost, the trees stood tall and watching. She didn't say it aloud, but she could feel it. The shape from last night hadn't vanished. It had waited. Behind her, the creature let out a sound, short, quiet. Not pain, not fear. It was the sound of remembering. Ruth turned back and saw him looking through the glass. His breath fogged the window. He was watching the snow. Then came the sound, not from him, from the forest. Deep, faint, like a note plucked on a cello string too large for any human hand. A call, low, resonant, ancient. The creature sat up, slowly, gaze locked to the trees. Maeve stepped toward Ruth. What is it? He's calling out, she whispered. And someone's calling back. But Ruth didn't move toward the door. She stayed rooted, watching the breath on the glass evaporate into nothing. Outside, the woods held their breath again. And this time, Ruth swore she saw movement just past the ridgeline. Too quick to catch, too real to deny. Something was coming, or had never left, and it wasn't done yet. Under the thinning snowmelt of early spring, the forest began to shift. Not loudly, not suddenly, but like something half asleep remembering how to move again. Ice along the tree limbs cracked and wept. The creek stirred beneath glassy crusts, murmuring their return. And deep in the woods near Aspen Fork, the creature that had nearly died in a winter storm stood beneath the morning light. Face turned east, as if drawn by a memory that pulsed louder than instinct. Ruth noticed it the second she stepped out onto the porch, how his broad frame stiffened. His nostrils flared faintly, how his massive shoulders leaned not toward the warmth of the cabin, but toward something else. She didn't speak. She only watched. Every morning since the second figure had appeared behind the trees, the Bigfoot had risen before dawn, stood silent by the window or near the tree line, eyes searching, breath slow and aware. And always, he faced east, toward something he hadn't said, but was waiting for. That morning, she followed. Not out of courage, not out of duty, but because something in her bones said it wasn't just about him anymore. The tracks he left in the wet earth were enormous, spaced wide, each one deep and purposeful. He didn't walk like a beast. He walked like someone with somewhere to go. The light came down filtered through fir branches, casting long stripes across the forest floor. Crows followed them for a while, then vanished. Somewhere off to the south, an owl called in daylight, which Ruth had always taken as a bad omen. The Bigfoot never looked back, not once. And still she followed. By midday, the snow had thinned to patches between the trees. Mud clung to her boots. Her thighs burned from the climb. She recognized these woods, not from duty, but memory. A few years back, she'd helped chart grazing lines for local cattle. They were near Blacktail Creek. And just beyond that, a stretch of overgrown meadow where a horse ranch had stood abandoned for a decade. Locals said the owners vanished in the middle of the night, left half-packed boxes and fresh coffee on the stove. No one ever bothered to rebuild. It was the kind of place kids whispered about, but never went. The wind shifted, and the Bigfoot stopped. His body went still. The trees around him grew suddenly quiet. Then, without warning, he turned off the trail and moved into the brush. Ruth paused. Branches clawed at her coat. She ducked beneath a fallen cedar and emerged into a clearing where time had collapsed. Rusted fencing slumped beneath bramble. An old hitching post leaned drunkenly against an alder. What was once a stable now sagged inward, its roof open to sky, and standing just outside the remains of a tool shed, sketchbook in hand, was a girl, maybe 17, lean, pale, eyes sharp as glass. She wore a threadbare canvas jacket 2 sizes too big, patched in the elbows, and a knit beanie pulled down tight. She didn't flinch when she saw Ruth. She didn't even blink. "You're not from town," the girl said flatly. "Neither are you," Ruth answered. The girl looked back at her page and continued drawing, slow strokes of charcoal over already smudged paper. Ruth moved closer, cautiously. On the page, rough but unmistakable, were footprints. Wide, long, with 5 spread toes and a defined arch. Dozens of them. Layered, tracked. Some labeled with dates and small arrows. The girl's fingers were blackened with graphite. "You seen it?" the girl muttered. "Haven't you?" Ruth hesitated. "What's your name?" "Iris," she said. "Penhall." Ruth exhaled. The Penhall family used to own the Blacktail horses. The records had said their granddaughter was taken in by a cousin near Missoula after the disappearance. Clearly, that didn't last. "You've been living out here?" Iris shrugged. "Better than foster care." She flipped the page. More drawings, some of branches bent at odd angles, one of a cave mouth, another of what looked like hands pressed into mud. "They come here sometimes," Iris said. "The tall ones. I stay out of the way. They know I don't follow." Ruth's voice went low. "They? More than one?" Iris pointed her thumb behind her toward the woods. "He came through here last week. Didn't even see me. Just went straight for the ridge. But a few days before that, a truck came. Late. Silver. No plates. Drove right up past the old livestock trail like it belonged here." Ruth felt her stomach turn. "How many people?" 3. 2 men. One stayed in the cab. The other two were dragging something from the back. It was covered in tarp, but it made noises. Crying. But not like a person. Not exactly. What did you do? I hid. Ruth swallowed hard. Where were they headed? They stopped by the old trough, Iris said. Unloaded the tarp thing. I waited until they left. The snow was still fresh enough to follow. There were blood drips, a chain trail. I followed it to the bend by the gulch. And I found this. She fished in her coat pocket and pulled out a thin bundle wrapped in an old napkin. Inside, matted with dried blood, was a clump of black hair. Not human. Not horse. Long. Coarse. Heavy. Ruth reached out, but Iris pulled it back. I didn't take it for you. I kept it for me, to remember. A low sound rumbled nearby. Both of them turned. The Bigfoot stood just behind a broken gate, his broad shoulders hunched slightly, breath visible in the cool air. He stared at the clump of hair. His eyes were wide, but not in fear. Recognition. He stepped forward, slowly, as if the earth itself might crack beneath him. He bent low, impossibly gentle, and touched the hair with one fingertip. Then he did something neither of them expected. He exhaled a single short note. Not a growl, not a cry. A word, or something close. Low, carried on breath and memory. Then he turned, walked a few paces east, and let out another note. Slightly louder. Calling. Ruth's throat was tight. He's searching for them. Iris's voice was small. You mean like more of him? He had a mate, maybe a child. They stood in silence. The woods didn't move. Then a breeze shifted the trees and something flickered in the distance. A broken fence, stained dark. Ruth approached cautiously. The snow here had only recently melted, revealing a patch of trampled soil. Bent fencing. Chunks of fur. Dried blood pooled near a metal post. Chains, broken, a hook embedded in a rotting fence beam. And farther still, the impression of a large form dragged toward the gulch. She turned back and saw Iris crouched near the dirt. Her hand rested beside something barely visible in the thawed mud. A handprint, not human, wide, deep, fingers spread wide, pressed into the earth like someone had stopped to brace themselves, or left a sign. Ruth stood in the quiet. Her mouth was dry. Iris, she said slowly, do you have more of these drawings? The girl looked up. Why? I need to know if they match what he's seen. I think he's trying to lead us. Iris nodded. I have dozens, some from months ago. They leave marks, symbols, like maps. She looked toward the Bigfoot, who now stood motionless, hand pressed against a pine tree as if listening through the bark. I think he's still listening for her. The shadows grew long. Sunset dipped the trees in burnt amber and smoke-colored blue. And before she turned to leave, Ruth saw it again. Just past the gulch. A single, massive handprint, pressed into the wet ground, fingers curled inward. Not random, not instinct. A message left behind, and the echo of something waiting to be found. Under the brittle sky of mid-spring, with snowmelt dripping steady from the eaves of old barns and the scent of pine sap bleeding into the wind, Ruth Ann Kepler drove alone through the thinning trees toward Elk Meadow. The dirt road carved through the hills in narrow veins of gravel and mud, still soft from the thaw. She hadn't driven this route in years, not since her rookie season when her father brought her up here to see the ridgeline elk migration. That was before the fire, before the long silence that swallowed what used to be home. The truck's tires hissed through a shallow puddle, windshield wipers squeaking every few seconds in a rhythm she hated but wouldn't shut off. The Bigfoot hadn't followed her. He stood that morning at the tree line again, facing the east, unmoving. Iris stayed behind, curled on the floor with her drawings, her head low, her voice quieter than usual. They both knew Ruth was chasing something now, something neither of them could stop. And it started with the Duvals. She hadn't seen Harlan in almost a decade. He was part of a dying breed. Mountain carpenter, veteran, whiskey for breakfast kind of man. Her father had trusted him once, back when men still shook hands without checking the wind. The cabin hadn't changed much. It leaned slightly to the left, like the whole structure had grown tired of standing up straight. Smoke curled from the chimney, thick and white against the cool sky. Ruth stepped out and crunched across the gravel. When she knocked, there was a pause long enough for doubt to creep in. Then the door creaked open. Harlan Duval stood in the doorway in his usual faded flannel, beard tangled down to his collarbone, eyes the color of November bark. He didn't speak, just looked at her like he'd seen a ghost walk out of his past. "I need to talk," Ruth said. He stepped aside. Inside, the wood stove clicked and popped. Tools hung from the walls, all hand-worn and sharp. The place smelled like sawdust and strong coffee. Harlan poured her a cup without asking, slid it across the table like this was just another Tuesday. "I heard about your dad," he finally said. "That was 3 years ago." He nodded slowly. Some things take longer to say out loud. Ruth sipped the bitter coffee and let the quiet sit between them for a long breath. Then she set the mug down and leaned in. "I need to know what Cade's doing with the land near Pine Ridge." Harlan didn't flinch, but his hands curled a little tighter around his own mug. "Don't go down that road, Ruth. I'm already halfway there. I mean it. I found barbed livestock steel embedded in something that shouldn't even be on that property. I found blood, chains, tracks. I found a girl who's been watching trucks come in and out of that site at night, carrying loads that move. And I found a symbol on a piece of skin that matches a drawing in my father's old journal. You want to tell me that's a coincidence?" Harlan looked at the stove for a long time before speaking. "Cade's my son," he said. "I don't say that with pride. I'm not here for an apology. I'm here for the truth." He stood, walked over to the bookshelf, and pulled out a folded map. His hands trembled slightly as he laid it flat on the table. Red ink marked a line cutting through the pine ridges west of the creek, ending at a hollow shaped like a crooked finger. "That's where the exchange happens," he said quietly. "I followed him once, thought he was just running livestock for side money, but what I saw, it wasn't cattle. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before." Ruth stared at the ink like it was burning through the page. "How long?" 20 years, maybe more. It started small, just tracks, noises in the woods. Then one day he brought something home, something caged, said it was part of a new market, collectors, rich men who'd pay more than the government ever did, and he made me promise to keep my mouth shut, said if I ever told anyone the forest would eat what I loved. "You believed him?" "I was a coward," Harlan whispered. "I let it fester. I let him build that goddamn compound out by the waterline. Now it's got walls, cages, armed patrols, cameras pointed at trees that have stood longer than we've been breathing." Ruth's voice cracked. "How many have they taken?" "I don't know," he said. "But I know the last one cried, not like an animal, like someone mourning." He reached into a drawer and pulled out something small, leather, knotted and old. A braided strap with faded stitching, frayed at the ends. He handed it to her. "I used to use that to tie my shovel to my belt, back when I built trail steps with your father. Thought it might hold something for you now." Ruth held it in both hands. The leather was dry but still warm from his grip. "You didn't have to help," she said. "I owed your dad," Harlan said, eyes glassy. "And I owe the forest more than that." When she stepped back outside, the air had cooled. A hawk circled high above the ridge. She felt eyes on her before she heard the gravel crunch. Far down the hill, just past the split in the trail, a figure stood half in shadow. Binoculars lifted. A long black coat. Rugged boots caked in dust. Rex Duval. She didn't wave, didn't run, just walked slowly back to her truck and climbed inside. Her heart was hammering. By the time she pulled back onto the forest road, the binoculars were gone. But she knew the message had landed. They knew she was digging. They knew she wouldn't stop. And now the shadows in the woods were watching more than just her. They were waiting for what she'd bring next. Jiang Viet, Huan Thien Chuang, Phaif Jai Ju Theojung, Chidan Va Dani Chi Tiet, Semat Vai Phut. The sun had barely dipped behind the ridges of Rock Creek when Ruth felt the shift in the air. That quiet, electric tension that always comes before something breaks. The sky was soft with the last light, pink bleeding into gray over the jagged horizon, but the road beneath her tires was nothing soft at all. It wound tight along the creek's edge, hemmed in by rock on one side and a steep drop on the other. The guardrail rusted, half-eaten by years of runoff and cold. Her truck vibrated with each turn. She kept one hand on the wheel and the other close to the flashlight between the seats, thumb tapping its grip in rhythm with the hum in her chest. The map Harlan had drawn still burned in her glove box. The roads weren't marked on anything official. They were old logging tracks and animal corridors, stitched together like scar tissue across the Montana timberline. But the name Rock Creek hadn't just been ink. It had weight. And tonight it carried the sound of tires not her own. Headlights bloomed behind her. Too fast, too bright. She saw the reflection flare in the side mirror and knew right away. It wasn't a Ranger, wasn't a local either. That engine was too big, too aggressive, and it didn't back off when the road narrowed. She pressed the gas gently, keeping control, eyes forward. The silver truck behind her inched closer. Grille wide, high beams blinding, front bumper thick with mud. Then it surged, nose almost kissing her tailgate. Her knuckles whitened on the wheel. She didn't look back. The road snaked to the right. That's when it struck, a sharp bump. Not enough to spin her out, just enough to say, "Pull over." She slowed, not by choice. There was no room to accelerate now. A cliff face rose hard on one side, and a steep ravine yawned on the other. The silver truck veered left, pushed up beside her, nearly brushing mirrors. She saw him then, through the open driver's window. Black coat, hair pulled back tight, eyes cold and focused. Rex Duval. He gestured. One hand, flat, palm down, like he was pushing her off the road without touching the wheel. Ruth braked hard, tires skidding into gravel. Her truck fishtailed slightly, rear bumper scraping the metal guard. She came to a stop just before the curve narrowed into a blind cliff bend. Dust rose around her. The silver truck blocked her in from behind. She got out slowly. The air between them was full of creek mist and twilight. Rex stepped out too, letting the door swing shut behind him. "You should have stayed out of this," he said, voice calm, almost apologetic. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you." Ruth didn't answer. "I'm giving you a chance," he said. "Let me take it back. Nobody has to get hurt." The woods behind them were quiet. Too quiet. Then something moved. It was fast, massive, and already there. From the dark mouth of the trees, the Bigfoot charged. Not at Rex, but past him, slamming its fists into the ground with a force that rippled through the road like thunder. The earth vibrated. Snow, still clinging to the pines above, shook loose and fell like a white curtain between them. Rex spun, startled, blinded just long enough for Ruth to move. The silver truck jerked forward as Rex scrambled to its door, but the snow had slicked the gravel. His tires caught nothing but air as the truck skidded sideways, rear axle twisting. Then the front end dropped. The truck slid off the edge and tipped into the gully, landing hard on its side in a crunch of metal and smoke. Ruth didn't hesitate. She scrambled down, boots slicing through wet brush, and yanked the driver's door open just enough to see Rex slumped against the wheel, dazed, forehead cut. Steam hissed from the radiator. She reached in and pulled him up by the jacket collar. His eyes fluttered. Behind her a shape rose in the mist. The Bigfoot stood at the ridge, backlit by the last gasp of light. Towering, unmoving. Rex blinked and saw it too. He froze. It didn't strike. It didn't roar. It just stood there, breath visible in the air between them, massive hands open at its sides. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. Ruth dragged Rex to solid ground, laid him back, and pressed her hand to his shoulder. "Next time you follow someone," she whispered, "don't bring the past with you." She left him there, bleeding but alive, and drove back through the dark with headlights off for most of the way. She didn't need them. The path was burned into her now. Back at Aspen Fork, Maeve and Iris waited inside, the room lit by soft lamplight. The Bigfoot was gone again, out into the woods, but something about the silence he left behind was heavier tonight. Ruth poured herself a cup of stale coffee and sat at the table. Iris slid a sheet of paper across the wood. "I remembered something," she said. "When I was real small, maybe 6, I stayed at Pine Ridge for a while. My uncle worked there before everything. He let me walk the ground sometimes. One night, I saw this. The drawing was crude, done in pencil, but unmistakable. A tall cage. Chains bolted into the ceiling. A creature hunched inside. Not wild, just tired. And beside it, another shape. Smaller, clinging to the larger one's side, eyes wide with fear." Maeve leaned in. "Is that a juvenile?" "I think so," Iris said. "They kept it sedated. I remember the smell, like burned medicine." Ruth's throat tightened. "Where were the cages?" "Back of the ridge, behind the water tanks. They called it the quiet pen. Only staff went in." Maeve looked pale. "You said they didn't just trap them." "They trained them," Ruth finished. Iris nodded. "They taught them to obey, to perform. Some didn't make it. They left the bodies in the lower shed." Ruth stood. Her breath was shaking now. "They're not just hunting them," she said. "They're breaking them." No one spoke. Then, from outside, a faint sound, barely audible, a note, low. Not speech, but not just noise, a mourning sound. They stepped to the window. The Bigfoot was back, standing near the tree line, holding something in one hand. The paper, Iris's drawing. He looked at it for a long time, then slowly lowered his arm and placed his hand flat against his chest. His shoulders rose once, then stilled. A single drop traced the fur down his chest. Not water, not rain, and no one could tell if it was grief or memory. But it meant something. Something they hadn't yet named. Something still waiting in the dark. Under a sky drained of color, Aspen Fork stood hushed in the cradle of the forest, its weathered logs barely visible beneath the wash of shadow bleeding from the trees. It was midsummer but felt colder than it should have. The clouds hung low, unbroken, like the mountain itself was holding back breath. There was no moon, no wind. Even the birds had gone quiet, and the dogs that usually barked from neighboring cabins hadn't made a sound since sundown. Ruth felt it in her chest before she heard it. A wrongness, a silence that trembled like the pause before a scream. She was halfway through locking the back shed when she heard the first crack of brush, faint, measured, not the sound of wildlife. 2 steps later, the dogs in the lower pasture erupted, not in warning but panic. Then came the headlights, wide beams knifing through the dark pines like floodlights, too bright for backcountry rangers. Her heart stuttered. She dropped the padlock and sprinted toward the main cabin. Maeve was in the kitchen, packing a first aid kit with shaking hands. Iris stood frozen at the window, eyes wide, mouth parted. "There's 3 trucks," Iris whispered. "Big ones with lights on the top." "They're not here to talk," Ruth said, reaching for the rifle mounted above the back door. She pulled Maeve aside and pressed the kid into her arms. "If things go bad, get Iris out through the south tree line. Follow the creek. Don't look back." Maeve shook her head. "I'm not leaving you. You'll be no help bleeding on the porch. Do what I said." The front porch lit up like stage light as the trucks rolled in, gravel grinding beneath oversized tires. One screeched to a stop in front of the ranger station. Another veered around back. The third sat idle at the trail split, engine humming low. Ruth slid beside the window and peeked out. Cade Duval, standing tall in the glow of his headlights, hands in the pockets of a black duster, boots planted like he owned the earth under them. A man stepped up beside him, holding something too small to be casual. Black steel, compact, low-slung. A weapon used by people who expected resistance. "Shut off the lights," Ruth said. "Turn off everything. If we go loud, It's only because they give us no other choice." She cracked the door and aimed the rifle through the narrow gap. Cade didn't flinch. "We don't want trouble," he called, voice smooth, too calm. "We just want what's ours." A second later, a figure moved past the tree line. Fast, towering, not human. The Bigfoot stepped into view behind the cabin. Maeve gasped. Cade didn't blink. "See?" he said. "There he is. Didn't even run far." He lifted his hand. A signal. A man on the rear truck raised a tranquilizer rifle. Ruth fired first. The glass in the front window exploded outward as the echo of her shot cracked the night in half. The man staggered, fell. The tranq rifle clattered to the ground. Chaos burst open. Flashlights swarmed the trees. Footsteps thundered against gravel. Maeve yanked Iris toward the rear exit. Smoke from the first gunshot still hung in the air. Then the cabin shook. Something slammed into the front door, wood splintering, hinges groaning. A second impact. Then it burst inward. The Bigfoot, not attacking, not destroying, protecting, he roared. Not an animal roar, not wild or chaotic, but something long and guttural, like a warning carried across time. It echoed off the hills, deep enough to make every rafter creak. The air changed. The dogs in Cade's truck howled and then went quiet. The men outside froze. Then the creature stepped forward and blocked the entrance with his body, chest rising and falling, blood already blooming through the fur on his left shoulder. He'd taken the bullet meant for Maeve. Iris screamed. Ruth fired again. One of Cade's men dropped in the grass near the wood pile. The others scrambled. Cade retreated behind his truck, watching, calculating. The Bigfoot didn't move. He let out another sound, lower now, more like a horn than a voice. It trembled through the ground. The horses in the nearby pasture kicked wildly. Somewhere in the dark, something crashed through the underbrush, fleeing. Rex Duval appeared then, just outside the tree line, hesitation written across his face. His jacket was soaked, boots coated in dust and blood. He held a shotgun, but it hung low at his side. He looked at Ruth, then at his brother, then at Maeve, crouched behind a barrel, clutching Iris. Something cracked open behind his eyes. He dropped the gun, ran toward the cabin. "Get her to the truck," he shouted. Ruth didn't question it. Rex scooped Maeve up, her side already blooming red where the bullet had grazed her rib cage. Ruth grabbed Iris by the hand and led them through the side yard. Cade's men were retreating now, dragging their wounded, calling out half-formed plans to regroup. One of the trucks peeled out. Another tried and failed to reverse through a thick pocket of mud. The headlights made strange shadows of the trees. Ruth heard Cade yell something, but his voice was lost under the sound of tires spinning. The creature stepped back from the porch, slumped against the doorframe, blood pouring freely from its wound. It was fading fast. Ruth knelt in front of him, pressed her hands to his chest. His eyes fluttered. He reached one hand slowly toward her badge, the brass pin she still wore on her coat. With fingers larger than any she'd ever seen, he touched it gently, then pressed it against her chest, then against his own, back and forth, like a vow. She understood. "You protect. Now it's yours." She closed her hand around his. "We're not done," she whispered. He closed his eyes. Didn't fall, just leaned harder into the frame. Behind her, the sun was coming up, faint, pale, but rising. When she turned back around, the trucks were gone. Cade had vanished. Rex sat behind the wheel of Ruth's truck, blood on his knuckles, quiet. The forest exhaled, and all around them, the breath of something older than memory stirred back into silence. She looked once more at the creature, still breathing, but just barely, the badge still in his hand, the promise still echoing in hers. And behind the trees, the path toward Elk Meadow waited, lined with shadow, flecked with light, and not yet finished. The sun was just beginning to fall behind the mountains when they reached the old fire road that split east toward the forgotten side of Pine Ridge. Dust curled in the wake of the convoy, Sheriff Cal's cruiser, 2 unmarked trucks from Fish and Wildlife, and Ruth's pickup pulling in last, its tires humming low like the breath before a scream. In the passenger seat, Iris clutched her sketch pad against her chest, pages pressed flat to keep the memories still. Behind them, in the third truck, Rex Duval sat alone, staring out the window with something between dread and debt in his eyes. Harlan had come too, sitting stiff and silent in the front seat of Cal's rig, hands folded around the rolled-up map he'd marked in ink and gilt. No one spoke as the trees swallowed them. The deeper they went, the older the forest felt, taller, darker, quieter. Pines hunched overhead like sentinels, and the road narrowed until even the light seemed to hesitate. Birds had stopped singing. The wind didn't touch the grass. It was the kind of place the world forgets on purpose. The plan was simple. In, document, extract. Ruth didn't trust it. Cal didn't either, not really. But they had no warrant, and Pine Ridge wasn't on any public registry. Technically, it was private land, Cade's land, or had been, until Harlan handed over that notarized deed. One sentence, one signature. Everything flipped. The preserve now fell under federal jurisdiction, just long enough for them to push through the side gate without a knock. They reached the perimeter as the sky turned orange, and the shadows cut clean across the fence. A chain-link monstrosity ran along the ridgeline, reinforced with steel posts and barbed coil, the kind used in military enclosures. Cameras blinked from tree trunks. Speakers clicked faintly in the dark. Harlan stepped out first, feet crunching the gravel. His hands shook as he pulled the gate key from around his neck, slipped it into the box, and turned. The lock gave with a reluctant click. "You sure this is the right way in?" Cal muttered. Harlan didn't look up. "I built it, I'd know." They moved in pairs, Cal and Harlan leading through the narrow switchback that dropped into the clearing below. Ruth stayed with Iris, her hand never straying far from her sidearm. The Bigfoot hadn't come. He hadn't moved since the night he bled on the threshold of Aspen Fork, and maybe that was for the best. But still, she felt him in her chest, in the hum of the leaves, in the thick quiet that grew with each step. They saw the cages first. Dozens of them. Row after row of rusted iron bars tucked beneath lean-tos and canvas tarp. Some were empty, doors left hanging open. Others were worse. The smell hit second, metal and meat. Old blood soaked into sawdust, sweet like rot. A barrel rolled lazily in the breeze. The clink of a chain echoed faintly from the far shed. Ruth moved faster. Iris caught up, her voice thin. "That one, the big one, that's where they kept her." She pointed to a tented enclosure near the far slope. Its fabric flapped once, then stilled. Ruth drew her flashlight and stepped inside, and there they were, curled in the shadows, pressed into each other like broken halves of something once whole. A female, ribs sharp through fur, chest rising in shallow breaths, and beside her, tucked under one arm, a juvenile. No bigger than a child, eyes wide, muzzle trembling. Both stared back, too weak to run, too hurt to hope. Ruth dropped to her knees. "They're alive," she whispered. Cal called in reinforcements. Maeve radioed from the ridge. Wildlife officers began filing in, snapping photos, cataloging everything. It was finally happening, but Ruth didn't hear them. Her world narrowed to the cage, the mother's eyes, the quiet rasp of air dragging in and out of lungs too tired to last much longer. She reached for the latch and pulled it open. The sound of a truck engine roared to life somewhere beyond the ridge. "Cade." Ruth spun around, sprinted uphill just in time to see a black Jeep fishtailing through the clearing. Cade's silhouette behind the wheel, head low, gas pinned. The map Harlan gave them hadn't shown the service road behind the fuel station. He had a way out, but someone was already moving. "Harlan!" The old man stepped into the path without hesitation, arms spread, eyes fixed. The Jeep didn't slow. It clipped him hard, tossing him into the ditch like paper. But Cade didn't get far. The front wheels struck a buried rock slab and jolted sideways, sending the Jeep into a spin. It slammed into a pine and crumpled inward with a groan of bending metal. Steam hissed from the hood. Cade coughed as he crawled out, dragging one leg. Then the forest parted. The Bigfoot emerged from the shadows, slow, deliberate, tall as grief. He didn't roar. He didn't run. He walked. Right past the officers, past Cal, past Ruth. Toward the cage. The female stirred. The juvenile reached for him. He dropped to one knee and placed his hand on the bars. The others reached through, fingers brushing, eyes locked. Something passed between them. Not words, not sound. Something older, something deeper. Then he turned, walked to Harlan, knelt beside him, placed one massive hand on the man's chest and stayed there, still as stone. Forgiveness, Ruth thought, or maybe just goodbye. Cal moved to cuff Cade, who didn't fight. He sat slumped in the grass, muttering something about empires and insurance and bloodlines. No one listened. The team worked quickly, cutting the cages, sedating the injured ones, preparing airlifts. Cameras rolled. Officers gave statements. Reporters began to gather at the edge of the forest by dusk. The story would be reshaped, redacted. But Ruth knew what had really happened. They hadn't just uncovered a trafficking ring. They'd witnessed a reunion, and that mattered more than anything printed in the paper. She stood at the edge of the woods as the Bigfoot led his family toward the trees. The child looked back once, raised a hand, small, tentative. Ruth raised hers in return. No words, just breath and silence, and the long hum of justice moving through the pines. 2 months had passed since the raid on Pine Ridge, and in Phillipsburg the leaves had begun to turn. They fell like slow-moving fire down Main Street, brushing against porch steps and windshields, and the boots of quiet men who remembered things without saying them aloud. The town didn't speak much of what happened out there near the ridge. Official statements called it an illegal wildlife trafficking ring. The Gazette printed one article, then quietly backed off. Most folks chalked it up to rich men doing sick things in the dark, just far enough off the books to be buried clean. But the ones who knew better didn't need ink or headlines. They remembered the sounds, the breath, the way the air had shifted when the truth finally came loose from the trees. Ruth Ann Kepler hadn't left the valley since that night. She'd stayed through the paperwork, the federal cleanup, the taped-off perimeter, and the long drives back and forth to the hospital in Missoula. Maeve had made it through surgery, narrowly. Her left side was a spiderweb of new scars, but her hands were steady again and her eyes hadn't dimmed. When she came back, she opened a small veterinary clinic in town. Not one for pets, but for rescues, strays, the kind of lives that came from forgotten hills and needed something gentler than sedatives in cages. She didn't charge. People brought her soup. Iris was living above the old firehouse now, in a loft Cal helped her fix up. Her drawings had shifted. Less cages, more mountains, less fear, more memory. She started mailing some of them to schools, forest safety, wilderness preservation, endangered species. No return address, just a page, a sketch, a truth too quiet to deny. Sheriff Cal had taken the brunt of the press when the state refused to move forward with broader prosecutions. Pine Ridge had too many shadow ties, too many men with long arms and clean boots. But Cal didn't blink. On a Tuesday morning in late September, he walked out to the bulletin board on the courthouse lawn and removed the last flyer in the county's most wanted window. Cade Duval's face. No one had seen him since the forest turned its back on him. Rex had testified under oath, then vanished too. No one chased him. Some debts weren't meant to be paid in public. And Harlan, well, Harlan left the world as quietly as he had entered it. He died 2 weeks after the raid, lungs full of something slow and cruel. But not before he signed over the ridge and everything east of it to a new land trust, Foxbrush Hollow Preserve. He named Ruth its steward, its keeper. The paper didn't say ranger, it said guardian. That morning, the air smelled like cinnamon bark and cold pine. Ruth stepped out onto the porch of the old watch station, now restored. Fresh paint on the logs, new window panes where gunfire had once split the silence. She poured her coffee and looked out over the treetops. The valley breathed slow and steady. Somewhere down in the preserve, a pair of moose moved along the marsh line. The wind rattled through the red leaves like dry laughter. She didn't expect to see them again. Not really. They had their freedom now, their silence. That was enough. But sometimes when the air shifted just right and the clouds hung low over Elk Meadow, she could still feel it. That echo in her chest, like a heartbeat not her own. That morning she felt it again. She didn't hear them first. She saw the stillness. The woods to the north had gone quiet. Even the squirrels had gone flat. And there, on the ridge above the mineral spring, 3 shapes, one tall and still as an old tree, one smaller, broader, more careful, and one small, a child's shape, light on its feet, curious. She didn't breathe. They stood there without moving. The wind brushed the ridge, and the smallest one stepped forward. It raised its hand, awkwardly, deliberately, placed it against its chest. 1 tap, then a second, then a third. Ruth blinked, her throat thick. She mirrored it, one hand flat to her chest. 1, 2, 3. The young one turned to the tall figure beside it. They didn't wave. They didn't speak. But they stayed there just long enough for something to pass across the clearing like a memory made real. Then they vanished back into the trees. Not a sound, not a leaf disturbed, like the woods themselves had opened a door just for them. Ruth stood there long after the shapes had gone. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the small weight of the old ranger badge. The one the Bigfoot had touched that night when he bled on her porch and gave her back something she hadn't realized she'd lost. She didn't wear it anymore. Not out loud, but she carried it, always. The sun broke through the clouds then, and the badge glinted, dull gold in the folds of her coat. Not like a medal, more like a vow. There were stories, she knew, that never ended clean. No credits, no parade, just breath in the trees and the slow return of silence. But every so often, if you listen just right, you can hear the forest remember. The way it keeps watch, the way it forgives, the way it breathes again when no one's watching. And that morning, as the wind rolled down through Phillipsburg and the branches bent low in something like prayer, Ruth didn't cry. She just stood there, hand on her chest, and listened. Sometimes, the stories that stay with us the longest aren't the ones with grand endings or loud conclusions. They're the quiet ones, the ones that unfold in the spaces between words, in the breath between one season and the next. Stories about wounds that never fully close, and about the rare, unexpected moments when something wild chooses not to run. There's a kind of truth you can only find in silence, in the hush of an old forest after the wind has passed through, or in the stillness of a heart that's finally learning how to forgive. This wasn't a story about monsters. It was never meant to be. It was about the fear we build around what we don't understand, about the ways we try to cage things we're afraid might be better than us, and about what happens when someone chooses mercy instead of vengeance, kindness instead of control. It was about how much quieter the world becomes when we finally learn how to listen. Because maybe compassion isn't just about saving something else. Maybe it's also about saving the part of ourselves we thought was lost. The part that still believes in second chances, in silent vows, in the simple act of showing up for something without expecting anything in return. Maybe healing doesn't always come with an answer. Sometimes it just comes with a presence, and sometimes that's enough. In a world that often moves too fast, where everything is captured, posted, and picked apart, there's still a place for stories like this, told slowly, held gently, remembered like a song that never needed a chorus. Stories that ask you to sit still, to look longer, to feel something without rushing to explain it. We don't always get closure, but we do get moments. And if we're lucky, we learn how to carry them forward with grace. So if you're still here, still listening, thank you. Thank you for walking through the quiet with us, for choosing to believe that not everything powerful has to be loud, that not every truth needs to be proven to be real. The woods are full of stories like this, of things seen and unseen, of bonds that form in the shadows, of protectors who live just beyond the reach of understanding. And maybe, just maybe, the most human thing we can do is not to chase them, but to honor their space. To recognize that the wilderness still holds pieces of us we didn't know were missing, and that sometimes what we find there isn't a myth, but a mirror. If this story meant something to you, we'd love to hear it. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us what stayed with you the most. And if you want to be part of more stories that speak to the heart and echo through the quiet, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow this channel. Your support means the world. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep listening for the stories the world forgets to tell.